Good morning and welcome to This Week. Sunday Showdown.
We've moved more than halfway, which is a fair definition of compromise.
It was the use of their power and their offices to target conservatives.
David Plouffe, Karl Rove. Each guided two winning campaigns for president, both top strategists at the White House. Now they face off for the first time on our Powerhouse Roundtable, taking on all the week's politics, the IRS and DOJ controversies.
This is an arrogant abuse of power.
Based on what the Attorney General said, I don't see the conflict.
A bold prediction for immigration, and that farewell to Washington from a Tea Party star.
I am confident that this is the right decision.
What it all means for the Obama agenda, the GOP, and you. Rove and Plouffe, only on This Week.
From ABC News, This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Reporting from ABC News headquarters, George Stephanopoulos.
Hello again. Let's get right to it with two of the most successful political strategists of our time, Democrat David Plouffe, Republican Karl Rove, here in our Powerhouse Roundtable, along with Arianna Huffington, editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, the Wall Street Journal's editorial page editor, Paul Gigot, and Gwen Ifill, the moderator and managing editor of the NewsHour on PBS. And a lot to talk about. Where I want to begin is it seems like after about a month of these controversies swirling around the White House, we're getting a sense of where the public is on all this. Latest Quinnipiac poll shows that far and away, Americans believe the questions about the IRS targeting conservative groups are the most serious, followed by Benghazi and the seizing of AP phone records by the Justice Department. More than 3/4 believe a special prosecutor should be appointed to look into the matter. And the drumbeat's starting to take a toll on President Obama's approval rating. It's underwater now. Almost half the country disapproves of the jobs he's doing. So, David, how much damage has this all done, and how does the president get a handle on it?
Well, first of all, I think most polls, and I believe the president's approval rating is higher than that, but I think people should be concerned about the IRS. It touches everybody in America. And I think that as we move forward here, the key thing, what the American people want to know is what is going to happen in terms of accountability, what changes are going to be put in place. And all these things deserve thorough investigation. I think the real challenge, George, is...
Special prosecutor?
No, and I think if people knew that the Department of Justice was engaged in a criminal investigation, you had Treasury undertaking the IRS a 30-day review, you had any number of congressional committees spending an inordinate amount of time on this, this is going to be looked into thoroughly as it should be. The question is that all Congress is going to do? Are we just going to be obsessed with scandal and trying to score political points, or the American people could not be screaming any more loudly, worry about us? Work on the economy. You're sent by us to do the job, to help us, to help the economy. The economy continues to strengthen and grow. So we ought to look at all these issues, and we ought to look at them thoroughly. But in the coming months, George, this is very important, because my suspicion is the Republicans in Congress will stay too obsessed kind of surfing scandals, trying to repeal Obamacare for the 40th time, and less on the economy and doing the job they were sent.
You worry about that?
I worry about it a little bit. I think David makes a reasonable point. This has to be a concern for the administration, too, which has, if you dig deeper into the Quinnipiac poll, people don't think the economy is good, and they don't approve of the president's handling of the economy. Even in the ABC Washington Post poll several weeks ago, it was 48-48 approval, disapproval on the economy. So I think it is important. But look, that'll happen because we're going to pass a budget. We're going to have a battle over the debt ceiling. We're going to have a question of whether or not we should continue the president's policy of trying to spend our way to prosperity, or whether we ought to put our fiscal house in order. So there'll be plenty of time to do that. But the Republicans have to pay attention to that. I agree. Look, there's a broader question here, though, and this is where the administration is going to have a problem. This IRS thing cuts to the heart of a lot of people's concerns about intrusive government. And as we find out more facts, I think the facts are not going to be attractive. We're going to find that the IRS targeted conservative political groups, not liberal groups, and that they targeted specific individuals, and they had outrageous requirements. Iowa Right to Life had to submit their prayers. People had to sign agreements not to protest in front of certain. And this is just ridiculous. This is worthy of a third world country,
Paul,
not the United States.
Your newspaper's been ahead on this, saying it showed on the paper, I think, over the weekend, targeting of some Republicans on the gift tax for their contributions to a nonprofit.
Yeah, I think that's the big vulnerability for the administration. How widespread was this? It started with the tax-exempt groups, which Democratic senators had said you should look into because they're not social welfare programs, instead they're acting politically. But now we're seeing that it's wider than this. We already have a group, Z Street, which was a pro-Israeli group, which says it was targeted explicitly because it had opposed settlements on the West Bank, which was, of course, different than the Obama administration policy. If it becomes that wide and you get a lot of individuals, then there's trouble.
But Arianna, still nothing here touching the White House.
No, not touching the White House, but there's no question that even a lot of Democrats are very upset about the way Holder has not just been pursuing what he's been pursuing in terms of leak investigations. But remember, last year bragging to the Senate Judiciary Committee that he has investigated more cases than any previous administration. So the IRS is a big problem. It goes beyond the two parties. It's really about the whole status of 501c4s and what are they about. You know, theoretically, they are there to promote the social welfare exclusively in one paragraph, primarily in another paragraph.
And not supposed to do too much politics.
And not supposed to do too much politics. I'm sure if we look at Crossroads GPS, it was all about politics.
Please. GPS, Crossroads GPS, an organization I helped create, but I don't run it. I'm not on the board. I'm not an officer. But the leadership knew right from the get-go they were going to be looked at closely. So the laws and rules that the IRS has promulgated for decades were followed very closely by GPS for exactly that. They knew they'd get extra scrutiny. Look, I love this. No concern about
problem with the left.
Well, but you know what? You're the first person I've heard on the left say that, because these groups, 501c4 groups, have been active for years on the Democratic side, on the liberal side, and there have been no criticism. There was no criticism from the left in 2000 when the NAACP voter fund spent $10 million to run an ad accusing George Bush of being a bigot. No concern on the left when Americans United for Change ran television ads targeting Republican senators up for re-election in 2007 and 2008 over the Iraq surge.
But what do you
David, go ahead, and then I want to bring Gwen.
Well, I'd say, first of all, back in the prior administration, the NAACP was investigated after Republican members of Congress asked for it. But there's been no suggestion. The independent, the prosecutor looked at this, the Inspector General, said there was no politics involved in this. No one has indicated at all that the White House was involved. The IRS director was appointed under President Bush, served under both presidents, attested. No one from, so this was not a political pursuit.
Baloney.
No baloney, Carl.
Well, if it was not political, then why are only conservative groups being targeted? Why did they pick
liberal groups targeted?
Oh, really? Name one. What liberal group had Tea Party or Patriot in its name that it was targeted? Not a single liberal group has appeared to say.
You're taking great license here, Carl.
No, I'm not. I am not at all.
This was not an effort driven by the White House. It would be the dumbest political effort of all time. Okay, this was.
I didn't suggest it was being driven by the White House, but I do think when the president.
So you think some people sitting in the Cincinnati office decided?
No. I think people sitting in Cincinnati, Laguna Niguel, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. listen to people like Senator Max Baucus, Senator Chuck Schumer, President Obama. When President Obama goes out in 2008 and 2010 and calls these groups, quote, a threat to democracy, he's blowing the dog whistle, and people heard.
How do you explain that when the administrator who was overseeing this went back and said actually narrow the guidelines, was trying to get them to change, and they wouldn't do it?
Well, look, that's my point. We have a culture at the IRS that has been going after conservative groups, and this administration has done an ineffective job of managing it. When this issue came up in 2010, if the administration was serious about it, President Obama should have picked up the phone and called Geithner at Treasury and said, you better get your Assistant Secretary for Treasury or the Undersecretary to check into this, because this is corrosive to our democracy to have the IRS targeting conservative groups.
I want to bring Gwen Ifill in on this.
Hello.
You were right. You tweeted yesterday it'd be hard to get a word in edgewise. You're exactly right.
It's fascinating.
But you have covered a lot of these scandals and so-called scandals. Where do you see this one going next?
I think that everybody is guilty of a little overreach in these kinds of arguments. What these polls show is that Americans are saying, why aren't you talking about me? They're interested that the IRS might be targeting people unfairly, but they're not so interested that they want to know the details back and forth. They say, well, the economy is going back. Does that mean that my teenage son is going to get a job this summer? Well, maybe not. And no one's talking about that. There's not going to be a kumbaya moment here. The politics is too ripe for all of that. There's no question. But when you talk about the Attorney General's job is to investigate leaks. I think if their leaks are damaging to national security, there's an argument to be made. That's what he's supposed to do. The question is whether he should be investigating journalists. And in fact, no journalist has ever been prosecuted for leaking.
And I do want to get to that right now as well. But I want to just hold for 1 second, because I want to go back to one final question on the IRS with David. Given where it is right now, do you think President Obama has to be more aggressive and actually order a house cleaning at the IRS?
Well, there's a review being undertaken by the acting commissioner that Secretary Lew ordered. You've obviously got the Department of Justice looking into it. As I said, any number of congressional committees are going to spend months and months looking at this. So I think when that review is done, if action needs to be taken, action will be taken. And I think that's what the American people want to know is, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? Because, there has to be trust in this agency. Obviously, I think that, and I want to mention, Crossroads, the Koch brothers, Adelsons, they drowned us in money in the last election. So the notion that somehow this was a premeditated scheme to silence people could not be further from the truth. There was some IRS employees who did a dumb thing here in terms of managing a remarkable influx of applications on the right and the left. They should have looked at everybody equally. They shouldn't have singled out anybody.
But also, this is a great opportunity to look at 501c4s because, Carl, you have to admit that neither Crossroads nor a lot of the liberal groups had anything to do with social welfare. They were really political operations hiding under a 501c4, very complicated, very confusing IRS rule. But I agree with Gwen. I think if you look at the Quinnipiac poll, 73% of people want to focus on the economy rather than on these three scandals, Benghazi, IRS, and the leak investigations. And, the president mentioned the middle class and the economy in his weekly address. He's doing the Cincinnati jobs and economy tour on Thursday. But, David, given the focus of this in the election, both the 08 and the 12 election, this seems to be such an intermittent preoccupation. It seems like every now and then the White House thinks of the middle class and the economy,
George,
and then they disappear.
You got to be able to do both of those at the same time. You've got to be able to focus on legislation with, I agree, immigration has its own political logic. You can do that separately, but you cannot simply sit here and say, we're going to grow the government as large as we have in the last 4 or 5 years and then not hold it accountable. You must look at how they are actually implementing these programs. And the IRS is the point of the spear for most Americans.
And that's why it hits
on
home
government.
for so many
That's where it hits home. And we're expanding its role for health care. A great deal. So you have to hold it accountable.
And the woman presiding over the tax-exempt division at the time that these things were undertaken is now in charge of implementing Obamacare.
Is that a tenable situation?
Well, again, there's a review going on, so I don't want to get ahead of that review. I'm sure that'll be looked at in the course of the next weeks here.
Let's talk about the DOJ investigation of journalists. We had the seizing of the AP records by prosecutors. You also had this Fox News reporter, Sir Rosen, was being targeted as well based on a leak he was getting from the State Department, very classified information concerning Korea. At first, Eric Holder, the Attorney General, said he did not ever contemplate prosecuting a journalist, but he turns out that Mr. Rosen comes up as a co-conspirator in the documents when they're going after his records. That's caused members on Capitol Hill to call for Holder to go.
Either Holder did sign off on an allegation that Rosen violated the Espionage Act, or he didn't know that that was in the affidavit that was filed in the court, and he doesn't know what's going on in his own department. Either case, he ought to resign, and because he's lost the trust of Congress and he's lost the trust of the American people.
Glenn Ifill, the Attorney General, has tried to get on top of that this week, describing friends describing a creeping sense of remorse over that targeting of James Rosen. He's met with several journalist organizations over the week on a kind of background basis, which has caused a lot of consternation with some. Is he going to have to go?
Well, you know how when it's about journalism, how kind of navel-gazy we get.
Right, the public doesn't seem to care about this.
Well, but we care terribly, so it has to be important. But there's not going to be a kumbaya moment here. One of the interesting things that's coming out of these meetings with newspaper bureau chiefs and broadcast bureau chiefs in Washington is that it turns out nobody knows how anybody does anybody's job. I guess I believe this, that it didn't occur to the people at the Justice Department that this is what reporters do all the time, that they go, that they urge, that they try to get information, that they flatter. The question to me becomes, to what end? Was that whistleblowing that we're talking about? We're just talking about getting information, secret information, for secret information's sake. And so journalists have to look at our motives and our accountability in these matters, as well as the administration.
But you've also heard from the Justice Department, Paul, as you go, is that they actually never contemplated prosecuting.
Well, that's what they say.
But
if you read that affidavit, it's pretty scary, because it does say aider and abettor of a conspiracy to leak.
But no reporter has ever been prosecuted for leaking, perhaps for not revealing a source.
Would that make you feel better if you were mentioned in that affidavit? It wouldn't make me feel better.
But you had whistleblowers being prosecuted. You had Thomas Drake and Jeffrey Sterling, both of them, incidentally, initiated in the Bush years. So this is a problem that precedes Holder. I mean, we've called on Holder to resign. There's no way Holder can continue to do his job as tainted as he has been. And as arrogant as he has been about what his department has been doing when it comes to the press. And I disagree with Gwen. This is not navel gazing. This is about the First Amendment. This is about freedom of the press. The president himself has said that you cannot have journalists being afraid that they're going to be in the crosshairs of the law while doing their job. He now has to take a real stand on this and not try to play it on both sides of this issue.
George, I agree that the press sometimes shouldn't publish things. We have to be responsible. But the guidelines were there in the Justice Department explicitly that Eric Holder ignored to narrow the focus on the AP. But even on, don't prosecute somebody. Even on Rosen, you're supposed to inform the media in advance. They didn't do that. You're supposed to narrowly tailor it. They're explicitly right there already.
There's some question about whether Fox News, I think, Karl Rove, actually got the subpoena or not. The Justice Department says there's a record of it being sent. Fox News says they don't have a record of it being received.
Let's be clear, though. Paul is referring to 913-400. These are the guidelines from the Department of Justice itself. It says the department attorney should take all reasonable steps to attempt to obtain the information through alternative sources or means. They must first attempt negotiations with the media aimed at accommodating the interests of the trial or grand jury with the interests of the media. They made no such attempt. They must also precede any request to subpoena the telephone toll records by having negotiations with the affected media, none of which they did. These are the guidelines which the Attorney General himself is responsible for implementing.
So he has to go?
Well, look, yes, I do think so. He's got two problems. One problem is when he signed the Rosen affidavit, he did not abide by his own guidelines. Second, the defense that they're offering for it, which was offered by Jay Carney, that we're conflating a subpoena with a prosecution, means that what they said, this is a member of a criminal conspiracy, when they sought the subpoena from the third judge they attempted to get it from and finally got it from, was not, they really didn't intend ever to prosecute him, so they were lying to the judge. And then the third problem he has is, on the 15th of May, he says before the House of Representatives under oath in front of the Judiciary Committee, this is something I'd never contemplated. And on the 17th, we learned that he did the Rosen.
I don't think he should go over this. I think, if anything, he's guilty of overzealously trying to uphold the law. And I think I think this is going to be a helpful process, which is how do we balance in 2013? Some of these guidelines go back to 1980, before the internet and email. How do we balance the need to protect national security secrets and our interest with the public's right to know and investigative journalism? I do find it curious that the loudest Republican voices now calling for the Attorney General to go were the same ones a year ago saying we weren't investigating leaks strongly enough. They wanted a special prosecutor because they said U.S. attorneys would not be tough enough. And so I think their objections lay less in the principle and substance of this than almost a Pavlovian response, that if they have an opportunity to take political shots at the administration of the president, they'll seek it.
There's definitely an irony in having Karl, who is the Michael Jordan of politicizing the executive branch. You know, let's go back to the firing of 9 attorney generals during the Bush years, now being outraged. U.S. attorneys. And, you know, I agree with you that Holder has to go, but there is a certain irony in Republicans who are doing very similar politicization things.
With all due respect, even the Holder Justice Department, which did an investigation of the U.S. attorneys, issued a report saying no such evidence of political activity in removing those U.S. attorneys. But let me go back.
They said partisan political considerations.
No, they didn't.
No, they didn't.
Yes, but
that's a fact.
No, they didn't. Here's the deal. They made a statement saying they found no evidence that there was anything wrong. There was politicization, which is the Holder Justice Department has never released the entire report because it would show the depth of how outrageous these charges were and how unsupported they were. They've never released the report. Now, but go back to your point.
Political interference in the Justice Department.
That's not true. That is not
true. Can I make one thing? I'm really waiting for the moment when any senior cabinet official leaves his job because the Sunday Talk Show has called for him to step down. Until he loses the confidence of the president, and maybe David knows this more than I do, I can't imagine him leaving.
And that's not going to, and that does why I do want to move on though now because
can I make one point though about political? Look. Last year, there's a difference between investigating leaks by going after the leaker and investigating the leaks by going after the journalist. And last year, you're right, a lot of Republicans said this administration was not doing a good job in looking after leakers. So what do? They go after the reporter who gets the innocuous leak about U.S. policy in response to a North Korean missile launch. Where was Holder going after the New York Times journalist who leaked the news?
Innocuous leak. They always showed it was deep inside the North Korean regime, it would tip them off into
well,
we're
look,
inside.
you're right. But my point is, it is not the world's greatest, which is what Holder said. This is the most outrageous leak in history. But again, the point is, there's a difference. Please do not conflate people who say the Obama administration ought to be going after the sources of the leak with going after the journalists who report the leak.
And don't conflate what happened with the Associated Press, which is a overly broad reach of hundreds of phone records, and what happened with the case at the State Department involving James
I got to tell you, though, Gwen, I think Paul made a great point. Do you really want the Justice Department to be subpoenaing the records of journalists by claiming that they're members of a criminal conspiracy? That is beyond the pale. Unless there was something, unless they're in the payroll of the North Koreans or the Russians, it strikes me that is really outrageous.
The common theme here, though, between the IRS scandals and the Holder problems is the coercive power of the state. That is, the president has been trying to redefine government in a benign way, expand it and say, you know what, it's really good for you. Well, sometimes it can be, but often it comes with a punch in the jaw. It comes with coercive power. And that's what happened in both of these cases.
But you know, we're living in this eternal present, and we keep forgetting the NSA surveillance that was not just about the press, but about the entire public, and that you had actually people going to Ashcroft's bedside in hospital to try and get it certified as being legal.
That was surveying terrorists overseas, not domestic.
Terrorists? How do you know they were terrorists? That's the whole point, that we are really ignoring that these have been pervasive and happening in the Bush years and continuing in the Obama years. And this is really the major problem with Obama.
And God bless President Obama for doing it.
He has continued a lot of the same
What did you say?
I said, God bless President Obama for doing it.
That is the perfect place to take a break. We do have to take a quick break.